Good evening and welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages. Tonight's show is another show in the series of programs supported by Oklahoma Foundation for the Humanities, and we'd like to thank them again for their support. My guest tonight is Dr. Marcia Haag. She's a friend and colleague. She's a professional linguist who works on American languages. Welcome, Marcia. Glad to have you on the show.
I'm very glad to be here.
And you're going to grace us tonight with some insights into the structure of the Choctaw language. So I think I'll just hand it right over to you.
Thank you very much. Now, as a professional linguist, a question that's often asked me is, well, which language is the best language? Isn't there a language that's better for science or one that's better for literature? Or isn't one more sophisticated than another? And aren't languages spoken by people from maybe more primitive or less developed cultures, aren't they less good all around? And I think that this might be like asking a gardener, well, which is a better flower, peonies or lilies? And of course the gardener would have to say, lilies are wonderful and they're magnificent, would go on talking all about lilies, the challenges of lilies, the difficulties of lilies, and then would go on with the same thing about peonies and maybe start talking about sunflowers for all we know. And the point would be that the gardener can't weigh one in terms of being better against another. And as a linguist, I'm so fascinated with languages in and of themselves that which one is better or more utilitarian for some purpose is just not a question that we can worry about. What we know now, or what we certainly believe now, and we have a lot of proof for this, is that we were made to speak languages, that languages are part of our human endowment. And you might even say that our brains are hardwired to have language inside them. And so our question would be, how can something that is so fundamentally the same look so different? Now tonight, rather than show you neat and quirky facts about Choctaw, I want to make a larger point. I want to talk about contrasting grammars. Now this isn't as onerous as it sounds. What I'm going to do is show grammar that we take for granted in English, things that we don't even think about in English. And then I'm going to show some things in Choctaw that you English speakers have never thought about, and show the huge range of possibility in human language. But first let me orient you to the Choctaw language itself, and I'm going to be very brief about this. Choctaw is one of the languages of the Muskegean family. These are languages that originate in the southeast part of the United States. The nearest relative to Choctaw is Chickasaw. The farthest relative of Choctaw is Creek, sometimes called Muskogee, and Seminole. Seminole and Creek are growing more and more alike over time. And it's also related to Coasati, to Alabama, to Miccosukee. These are languages that are very, very endangered. They have only a few speakers left. And it's also related to the extinct language Hitchiti. I'm also going to talk very briefly again about some of the sounds of Choctaw. Now, when we learn Choctaw, it's a language that's really pretty easy to pronounce because many of the consonants are similar enough to English so that the English speaker can make them without too much trouble. So that we have words like hatak, ohoyo, falaya. Those are not so hard to make. There is one consonant called the voiceless lateral fricative, which is the technical term for this. And this is the sound, and I tell my students, make an L and then turn your voice off. So if you would go, oh, and that would give you words like samko, which is the word for strong in Choctaw. Now the vowels, as vowels often are much farther away from English than the consonants are. Now English has many, many, many vowels. Well, we have 11 actually. But the English speaker can make very fine distinctions in the quality of vowels, that we can hear the difference between I, a, o, u, Those are very fine distinctions that we can make. Choctaw has only 3 vowel distinctions, and those distinctions are I, o, a. And so you'd say, well, how can you get by with 3 vowels? Well, the thing is that there's a lot more to vowels than just their quality. There's also something called length. And in Choctaw, we have a short vowel and a long vowel, and that would give us I, ah, o. And we also have nasality, so that we can have a nasal vowel, I, o. So that gives us 9 distinctions in vowels. And so we can say things like hakalo, hankalo, chito, chinto, ikana, ikana, ofe, kopole. This is so 9 vowels based on nasality and length as well as the quality of the vowel. Briefly about spelling, which is technically called orthography. Choctaw is written, but it began to be written using the English alphabet when the missionaries first began working with the Choctaw in the early 1800s. The most famous of these was the missionary Cyrus Byington, who did the most important work on Choctaw probably to date. And the missionaries were forced to shove Choctaw into the English alphabet. Now, most of the consonants fit pretty well, but the vowels are much less well fit. And so we have things like the letter U is used for the short O, and the letter O is used for the long O. And so you'll have the word for dog, which is spelled U-F-I and pronounced Ofi, is often misread as Oofy by the English speaker who doesn't know what they're doing. And so we hear a lot of clobbering of Choctaw by people who are reading it and not quite knowing what they're doing. But I came here tonight to talk about the structure of Choctaw and to show the differences in the grammars. So I have some sentences here that I'd like to show. I have 3 sentences. It's the same meaning in 3 different languages: English, Spanish, and Choctaw. So let's just look at them. The dog sees a squirrel. El perro ve una ardilla. Ofia funny pizza. Let's see if we can match them up as far as their grammars go. Usually, what we call lexical items, or words that refer to things in the real world, are pretty easy to find in any language. So we can match up, let's see, dog, perro, ofe, squirrel, ardilla, funny, and the word for si, ve, pizza. So let's take a look right now. First of all, we have the subject, verb, object in Spanish, but in Choctaw we have the subject, the object, and the verb. And this is a pattern that is very, very strong in Choctaw. The verb comes at the end, and we rarely see a different kind of word pattern from this. So this is the first thing that we notice right away. But let's go on and try to match up the other words that we have. Let's look at this word the. The, el, a squirrel, una ardilla. But where is the word for the and I in Choctaw? We have this ut word, and some people have tried to say, well, ut is the, but where is with funny? Well, it turns out that ut is not a word for a or the. Ut is something called a subject marker. In Choctaw, we have a special piece that marks what the subject is. Now, this is a very big difference because in English and Spanish, we just use the position of the nouns in the sentence to tell us that it's the subject. Choctaw makes us say explicitly that something is a subject with a little marker. Okay, but how do we then get the sense of and the? Can't we do that? Well, as it turns out, English and Spanish too, to some extent, are languages that insist that we mark whether something is definite or indefinite. And certainly one way to find out if we're dealing with a native speaker in English is to hear whether they get all the us and the thes in the right place, because it's very difficult to do that. A native English speaker always knows exactly where to put those. And I think we get the idea that they are somehow mandatory in a language. But many languages do not have to bother with and the all the time. They get them by context. Now, can Choctaw make things more definite and more indefinite? Absolutely. In fact, there are so many markers that can do this and so many grades of definiteness that we really don't have words enough in English to translate them. The important thing is you don't have to say that in Choctaw. You must say it in English. It's obligatory. All right, so obligatory marking of definiteness in English, an optional thing to do in Choctaw. Let's look at number 2. We'll move on. This time we've got 2 dogs see 3 squirrels. And in Spanish, dos perros ven tres ardillas. Choctaw, we've got ofi tokolochat, vanitochina pinsa. All right, 2, dos, 3, tres. All right, and notice that in both of these languages, when we got the plural, we had dogs and we had squirrels. And exactly the same thing in Spanish, perros, tres ardillas. And furthermore, on the verb, we had to use a special plural form. We had dogs sees, but 2 dogs see. And Spanish even more prominent, perros ven, where each person and number has a special verb form that is used, so that the verb agrees with the subject, at least in whether it's singular or plural. Let's look at Choctaw. Ofi toklochat vanitochina pinsa. The word tokolo means 2, tochina means 3. That number comes after the noun, which is not so exciting. We already know that ut marks the subject, but nothing happened to Ofi. Nothing happened to funny, and nothing happened to pisa. There's no plural marking on the noun, and there's no plural agreement on the verb. So once again, well, how do Choctaw people know when something is plural? Well, by context. Usually we know if we're talking about things that are plural, and if you really need to know, you just put a word like 2, 3, many, some, or anything else that you need to do. Okay, so in English, we cannot speak unless we mark our nouns for number and our verbs for number agreement. In Choctaw, that's optional. And so you say, well, you know, it looks like this language, they're just sort of getting by. But what really happens is that in Choctaw, we have many fancy ways of marking number. For instance, there are verbs that only mean plural subject or even plural object. For instance, there's a word that means to pick up something, to pick up one thing, but if you pick up many things, you have to use a different verb. So we have a straightforward, rigid rule in English that takes care of plurals, and a very, very luxurious vocabulary in Choctaw that takes care of plural marking, a very different way of doing it. All right, I need to move to my next set. I'm going to move this board. Let's get more complicated. I'm going to now move into 2 clauses. Usually what that means is that every time you've got a new verb, you've got a new clause. The man knows that the dog sees a squirrel. Okay, the man knows is one clause. Knows what? That the dog sees a squirrel. In Spanish, el hombre sabe que el perro ve una ardilla. And in Choctaw, hatakat ofia fanipinsakan ikana. Okay, now, let's start matching up again. In Spanish and English, the, man hombre, no sabe, that que, the el, dog perro, sees ve, a una squirrel ardilla. Now, no matter how much you must have suffered through Spanish, those of you who have studied it, one thing you'll notice is that the structure of Spanish is amazingly similar to English. Every one of those words matched up in exactly the same position, English to Spanish. But let's look at Choctaw. All right, the word for man is hatak. The word for no is ikana. So we've got man subject, dog subject, squirrel, sees, ka, knows. Well, what's going on here? First of all, what is quand? Well, quand is going to be that, but it's a very special kind of that. But let's also look at the way the clauses are put together. Hatak is the subject of knows. Ofi is the subject of sees. So rather than having the clauses chained together in a line, we have the clauses nested inside each other with the main clause on the outside and the dependent clause on the inside. Very different. Now we're going back to this word that. What we have in Choctaw is something that I call subject tracking. Okay, it has a fancy linguistic term, but I'm not going to use that. And that has to do with this. Let's look at English. He knows that he saw a squirrel. Notice that in English, that can mean two things. That can mean Bill knows that Bill himself saw a squirrel, or it can mean Bill knows that John saw a squirrel. And there isn't any way to tell which one is which in English. Context, of course, but nothing in this sentence will do that for you. Look at Choctaw. Fanipinsakat ikana, fanipinsaka ikana. What this means is that if it's cut, the same guy who did the seeing of the squirrel is the guy who does the knowing, and if it's ka, the person who saw the squirrel is not the one who did the knowing. The same he, a different he. All right, now English never makes us worry about this, and the important point here is that this is obligatory in Choctaw. A Choctaw speaker cannot go through a sentence without tracking the subject all the way through the discourse with lots and lots of little markers like this. Now in English, we could sit around for the next 1,000 years and we would never hit on doing something like this. All right, this is built into the grammar. It is a completely separate thing that the Choctaw are doing that we don't do at all. All right, and last, I want to show you another thing that Choctaw does that we don't do at all, and that is something called aspect. Now, English just doesn't have aspect. We just don't do this. We can talk about it and we can say things with aspect, but aspect is something that is built into verbs having to do with the way something develops in time. English is preoccupied with tense, but there's another part of a verb having to do with the way something happens. And the best way is to give you an example of aspect. These two Choctaw sentences look very much alike. One of them, holisso ishi, means he got a book. Holisso inshi, he has a book. Where ishi and ishi are related, but one of them is marked with a different aspect. And it works like this. If I get a book, that's an event. I get it. It starts and it stops. Once I get a book, I have it. I have it over time. I'm in a state of having this book. That's called a state of aspect. In English, we often have to use completely different verbs to get at those meanings, but other languages allow you to change a verb in some slight way and get the idea of a different aspect. Let's look at, there are 5 aspects in Choctaw. Each of them involve a slight change in the verb stem, and I'm going to show you what happens when we take a Choctaw verb all the way through the aspects. Let's take that word know, that ikana that we had before. Ikana, she learned it. Ikana, she knows it. Ikahna, she recognized it. Ikahana, she ruminated about it. Ikayana, she remembered it. Now, all of these have to do with some kind of mental activity that require 5 different verbs in Choctaw, but they have to do with the event of taking information in, holding the information in your brain, suddenly grasping some information, thinking about a bit of information over and over again, and finally coming across information again. It's one mental activity put through different aspects. So you see that Choctaw can get lots and lots of mileage out of the same word by changing the aspect. Let me show you one more, because this can happen with any verb. Let's take the verb fukka. Fukka means get dressed or put your clothes on. In the event, fukka got dressed. Fonka, now that I am dressed, I'm wearing clothes. To wear them over time. Fahukka suddenly got dressed, threw on a jacket. Fahonka kept changing clothes over and over. Foyokka finally got dressed. My little boy got up and he finally got dressed. Okay, so we can do this with any verb. The point, once again, being that in Choctaw you must do it. Every Choctaw speaker has got to make a decision with every verb that he speaks. What way is this action happening in time? All right, now this is anything but primitive. This is an extremely sophisticated way to be working in your verb system. Okay, we don't do this at all in English. We have different kinds of different words that we may use. We use a lot of adverbs or idiomatic expressions. The thing is that we can get at all of this information, but it's not built into the grammar the way it is in Choctaw. So these are very exciting, I think. I could go on and on about lots and lots of different things like this, but I'm hoping that you got the idea of what it means for something to be marked in the grammar of a language, left out of another, while focusing on some other different piece of grammar in the language. This is a lot of what linguists do, and it certainly is not about which language is better than another. You know, I've been working on Choctaw for about 6 years now, and I work with a number of speakers. And one of the things that I find, and I think that Alice has mentioned this on previous shows too, is that speakers are so humble about their language and even, I will say, apologetic for their languages. They seem to think that they aren't as interesting, as sophisticated, or as good maybe as other languages, that they don't have as many words. Or remember the word order in Choctaw where we had subject, object, verb. Choctaw speakers have said that they speak backwards. Now this is very painful to listen to, thinking that somebody might speak backwards. When those of us who study American language are constantly being delighted and thrilled by wonderful things that we have never seen in our lives before. I like to reckon it to the species of plants and animals in the Amazon, where we have hundreds of thousands of species that no one has ever seen before, and we worry about eliminating them and driving them to the edge before we've even known what is there. And I like to think of languages that give us insight into human cognition. That's what we're really worried about, or at least that's what linguists worry about, is how is the human brain put together? One of the main doors to understanding human thought is language. And we need to know what things is the human brain capable of when they study grammar, when they have a grammar. And by seeing what Choctaw can do, and models that Choctaw can make, and by using that as a map to how the human brain works, we see how all human cognition can work. So this is very exciting to us, aside from the just interest of it in and of itself. So that is why I work on languages as a scientist, to find out what is up there for people, what's up there in people's heads. So.
Well, thank you very much, Marcia. This has been really enlightening. I totally agree with you. I think every language and culture is another window into what it is to be a human being. And if more people could appreciate that point, I think it'd be a much kinder, friendlier, diversity-friendly sort of world. I think this has been very helpful. I certainly cannot judge your Choctaw, it sounded amazingly good to me, but I know for sure your Spanish pronunciation is excellent, so I'm sure we can rely on everything that you've said.
My Choctaw gets better and better, Alice, as I go along. One of the wonderful things is that I'm learning to speak Choctaw. Not well, but I'm much better than I was when I started, and it's very pleasurable for me.
A lot of linguists will specialize in the study of a language, and they'll become very good at the analysis, but never pick up any fluency, and their pronunciation may be a little off because that's really not their goal. But obviously, you've paid some attention to both sides of it, and I think it really it makes a much better teacher of a person if they can have some actual fluency or at least very good pronunciation as well as insights into the structure. It's really a neat thing, and I know you've worked with some very good fellow teachers who have had good insights, perhaps not in the professional linguistic way, but that help you to see what makes this language tick. And thank you very much for sharing with us what you've been able to understand about Choctaw. It's just fascinating.
Thanks again.
Thanks again for coming. And thank you, audience, everyone. We're very pleased to have had you tonight. Please join us again next week on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene madaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene madaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene madaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene madaone kita.